A little beggar girl found the Millionaire's unlimited credit card on the streets, and what she asked for in return made the millionaire cry. In the bustling streets of the city, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the smell of smog, a small figure moved cautiously through the crowd. Emily, a girl of barely 10 years old, with tangled hair and worn-out clothes, walked with her eyes wide open, always alert. Her home was the street. Her family consisted only of her father, and her life was a constant struggle to survive. As she dodged hurried passers-by, something shiny caught her attention. There, in the middle of the sidewalk, lay a credit card. Emily picked it up with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the name engraved on the plastic, Alexander Thompson. Even she, at her young age, knew that name belonged to one of the richest men in the city. For a moment, temptation overcame her. With that card, she could buy food, new clothes, maybe even a place to sleep. But as quickly as that thought came, she pushed it away. Her father had always taught her that honesty was the only thing that truly belonged to them, and she wasn't willing to betray that principle. With determination, Emily tucked the card into the pocket of her worn jacket and began walking towards the place where she knew she would find her father. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a spectacle that contrasted with the harsh reality of the streets. As she walked, Emily couldn't help but think about what that card meant. It was more than just a piece of plastic. It represented a life she could only imagine. Luxuries, comforts, security, everything she and her father had longed for so long. Finally, she reached the alley where her father usually waited for her. She found him sitting on the ground, leaning against a brick wall, with an expression of relief upon seeing her arrive safe and sound. "Dad," Emily said, approaching him with a mix of excitement and concern, "I found something." Her father, a middle-aged man with premature wrinkles and tired but kind eyes, looked at her curiously. "What did you find, my girl?" Emily took the card out of her pocket and showed it to him. Her father's eyes widened as he recognized the name. "Emily," he said in a soft but firm voice, "you know we have to return it, right?" The girl nodded without hesitation. "I know, Dad. But how are we going to find the owner?" Her father stood up with difficulty, fatigue evident in each of his movements. "We'll find a way," he said, putting a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder. "There's always a way when you do the right thing." As they walked away from the alley, with the card safely stored away, neither of them could imagine how that small piece of plastic was about to change their lives forever. Fate had set in motion a series of events that would shake the foundations of more than one life, and it all began with a little girl's decision to do the right thing, even when no one else would have noticed. Dawn arrived with a cold breeze that crept through the cracks of abandoned buildings. Emily woke up, curled up next to her father in a corner protected from the wind. Despite the cold and hunger, a determination burned in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, gently shaking her father's shoulder, "we have to return the card today." Her father, Jack, slowly opened his eyes. The fatigue of countless nights without proper sleep weighed on him, but seeing the resolution on his daughter's face, he felt a surge of pride that gave him strength. "You're right, my little one," he said, sitting up with difficulty. "But first, we need to get something to eat." Emily nodded, although her stomach growled with hunger. She knew her father hadn't eaten in days, making sure she had at least a bite each day. Guilt gnawed at her, but it also reinforced her determination to do the right thing. Together, they went out into the streets that were slowly coming to life. The first rays of sun reflected off the glass buildings, creating a mirage of beauty amidst the harsh reality of the city. As they walked, Jack noticed a newspaper stand. Cautiously, he approached and asked the vendor if he could take a quick look at the local news. The vendor, moved by Jack's disheveled but dignified appearance and Emily's innocent look, nodded. On the front page, an article caught his attention. "Millionaire Alexander Thompson announces charity event in the city center." "Emily," Jack called to his daughter, "I think we know where we can find the card's owner." The girl approached, her eyes shining with a mix of hope and nervousness. "Really, Dad, how will we do it?" Jack explained the article to her, and together they devised a plan. The charity event would take place that same afternoon at the luxurious downtown hotel. It would be their chance to return the card. However, as the day progressed, hunger became more intense. Emily noticed how her father stumbled slightly as they walked, weakened by the lack of food. "Dad," she said with a trembling voice, "we should use the card to buy something to eat. Just once. No one would know." Jack stopped, looking at his daughter with a mixture of understanding and firmness. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the pain in his knees, and took her small hands in his. "My dear Emily," he began, his voice soft but full of conviction, "I understand that you're hungry. I feel it too. But our integrity, our honesty, is the only thing that truly belongs to us. We can't sell it, not even for a piece of bread." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, understanding the depth of her father's words. "Besides," Jack continued with a tired smile, "imagine the surprise on Mr. Thompson's face when we return his card intact. That expression will be worth more than any meal." Emily threw herself into her father's arms, hugging him tightly. At that moment, in the middle of the busy street, father and daughter shared a moment of love and understanding that no wealth could buy. With renewed determination, they continued their way to the hotel. The afternoon sun fell upon them, and although their stomachs were empty, their hearts were full of hope and dignity. As they approached the imposing hotel building, Emily squeezed her father's hand. "Whatever happens," she said with a maturity beyond her years, "we're doing the right thing." Jack nodded, a mixture of pride and love filling his chest. Together, father and daughter, they headed towards an encounter that would change their lives forever, unaware that fate had prepared surprises that they couldn't have imagined even in their wildest dreams. The Golden Hotel rose majestically in the heart of the city, its glass doors reflecting the last rays of the afternoon sun. Emily and Jack stopped in front of the entrance, feeling small and out of place amid the opulence that surrounded them. "Are you ready, my girl?" Jack asked, gently squeezing his daughter's hand. Emily nodded, gathering all her courage. Together, they crossed the revolving doors and entered a world that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. The hotel lobby was a spectacle of luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, pouring golden light over polished marbles and Persian rugs. Businessmen in expensive suits and women with glittering jewels circulated through the place, all seemingly oblivious to the presence of the two newcomers. Jack approached the reception desk, where a young woman in an impeccable uniform looked at them with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "Excuse me, miss," Jack began with a firm but respectful voice. "We're looking for Mr. Alexander Thompson. We have something that belongs to him." The receptionist looked them up and down, clearly doubting their intentions. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Thompson is in a private meeting. I can't interrupt him." Emily, sensing her father's growing frustration, stepped forward. "Tell us, please," she said in a soft but determined voice. "It's very important. We found his credit card and want to return it to him." The mention of the credit card caught the receptionist's attention, who looked at them with renewed interest. She was about to respond when an authoritative voice resonated behind them. "What's going on here?" Emily and Jack turned to find themselves face to face with a tall, well-dressed young man. His face, though attractive, showed an expression of disdain and superiority. "Matthew Thompson," the young man introduced himself, looking at them suspiciously. "I'm Alexander Thompson's son. What's this about a credit card?" As he spoke, Emily noticed how Matthew's disbelief and then to hostility. "Do you expect me to believe that story?" Matthew spat, his voice loaded with contempt. "Klaus, it's obvious you tried to use the card and, seeing that it didn't work, decided to return it to avoid trouble." Emily felt tears filling her eyes at the unfair accusation. "It's not true," she exclaimed. "We haven't used the card. We just want to do the right thing." Matthew let out a sarcastic laugh. "The right thing? People like you don't know what's right. You surely planned to use it and something went wrong. Who knows how many other cards you've stolen?" The accusation deeply hurt Emily and Jack. Despite hunger and fatigue, both stood firm, dignified in their honesty. "Young man," Jack said in a calm but firm voice, I understand your distrust, but I assure you our intentions are pure. If I could speak with your father—" "My father doesn't have time for scammers," Matthew interrupted. Then, addressing the receptionist, he ordered, "Call security. Have them escorted out of the hotel and make sure they don't come back in." Emily's heart sank. They had come so far, had resisted hunger and temptation, only to be treated like criminals. Tears began to run down her cheeks, not out of fear or shame, but frustration at the injustice of the situation. Jackie, seeing the pain in his daughter's eyes, made a decision. With a quick movement, he took the credit card out of his pocket and held it up. "Here's the card," he said in a clear and strong voice. "Intact, unused. If you don't believe us, check the records. We haven't spent a penny." The gesture took Matthew by surprise, who for a moment seemed to doubt. However, his pride overcame his reason. "Security will take care of checking that," he said, gesturing to the guards who were already approaching. "Meanwhile, I want these two out of my sight." As the guards escorted them towards the exit, Emily looked back, her eyes meeting Matthew's. In that look was a mixture of pain, disappointment, and, surprisingly, compassion. For a brief instant, Matthew seemed to see beyond his prejudices, catching a glimpse of the truth in the girl's eyes. But the moment quickly passed. The hotel doors closed behind Emily and Jack, leaving them once again on the cold street, with heavy hearts but clear consciences. "I'm sorry, Dad," Emily whispered, resting her head on her father's arm. "Maybe we should have used the card to eat something after all." Jack hugged his daughter tightly, feeling how she trembled slightly, whether from the cold or emotion. "No, my girl," he said in a soft but firm voice. "We did the right thing. Our conscience is clear, and that's worth more than any food or comfort." As they walked away from the hotel, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from one of the upper windows. Alexander Thompson, the true owner of the card, had witnessed the entire scene. Alexander Thompson stood looking out the window long after Emily and Jack had disappeared from his sight. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and thoughts. On one hand, there was disbelief at the gesture of honesty from those two people who were evidently going through difficulties. On the other, there was shame for his son's behavior. With a determined step, Alexander left his suite and headed to the lobby. He found Matthew chatting animatedly with some guests of the charity event, as if nothing had happened. "Matthew," Alexander called, his voice calm, but with a tone that admitted no reply. "We need to talk, now." The young man excused himself to his interlocutors and followed his father to a secluded corner of the lobby. The smile disappeared from his face upon seeing Alexander's serious expression. "What's wrong?" "Dad?" he asked, trying to maintain a carefree tone. Alexander looked at him fixedly. "I saw what happened with those two people, the girl and her father." Matthew paled slightly, but tried to maintain his composure. "Oh, that... I was just protecting our interests. They could have been scammers or—" "Silence?" Alexander interrupted, his voice loaded with disappointment. "Those people came to return my credit card. A card that, I must add, has a practically unlimited limit. They could have spent thousands of dollars without me noticing, but they chose to do the right thing." Matthew lowered his gaze, feeling for the first time the weight of his actions. I didn't know," he murmured. "Exactly," Alexander continued. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to listen. You judged based on appearances and prejudices. That's not what I've taught you, Matthew." The young man looked up, a mixture of shame and defiance in his eyes. "And what do you want me to do? Blindly trust anyone who approaches us?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "No, I want you to learn to see beyond appearances. I want you to understand the true value of integrity and honesty." He paused, as if considering something. "And I think I know how to achieve that." Matthew looked at his father with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What do you mean?" "You're going to spend the next 24 hours living as a homeless person," Alexander declared. "No money, no phone, nothing more than the clothes you're wearing." Matthew's eyes widened. "What? Dad, you can't be serious. I have commitments, meetings." All that can wait, Alexander interrupted. This is more important. You need to understand how less fortunate people live, feel what they feel. Only then can you develop true empathy. Matthew wanted to protest, but something in his father's look told him it was useless. He knew that when Alexander Thompson made a decision, it was immovable. Okay, he finally yielded. When do I start? Right now, Alexander responded. Give me your phone, your wallet, and your keys. With trembling hands, Matthew handed over his belongings. He felt as if he was about to jump into the void without a parachute. One last thing, Alexander added as Matthew headed towards the exit. I want you to find that girl and her father. When you find them, I want you to listen to them. Really listen to them. Their story could teach you more than you imagine. Matthew nodded mechanically and left the hotel. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The streets bustled with activity, people returning home after a long day of work. Others going out to enjoy the night. For the first time in his life, Matthew felt completely alone and vulnerable. He had no idea where to go or what to do. The world he had always known, full of luxuries and comforts, now seemed unreachable. As he walked aimlessly, his thoughts returned to the girl and her father. Where would they be now? How did they survive day to day? And most importantly, how could they maintain their integrity in such difficult circumstances? With a sigh of resignation, Matthew ventured into the city streets, ready to face the next 24 hours that, unbeknownst to him, would change his life forever. Night fell over the city, and with it, a cold breeze that made Matthew shiver. Only a few hours had passed since he left the hotel, but he already felt as if he had been wandering for days. His feet ached, accustomed to designer shoes and not long walks on asphalt. As he wandered the streets, Matthew began to notice details he would have overlooked before. He saw people rummaging through garbage containers in search of food or something useful. He observed others huddled in doorways, trying to protect themselves from the cold. Each face told a story of struggle and survival. Hunger began to take its toll on him. The aroma of food coming from nearby restaurants was a constant torture. He approached one, thinking that maybe he could convince the owner to give him something to eat, promising to pay later. But as soon as the manager saw him, with his now wrinkled clothes and disheveled appearance, he asked him to leave. It was at that moment that Matthew truly understood what it meant to be invisible to society. The same people who days before would have treated him with deference now looked at him with distrust or simply ignored him. As the night progressed, the cold intensified. Matthew sought refuge in a nearby park, sitting on a bench. It was there that he met Ellen, an older woman who had been living on the streets for years. "First night, huh?" Ellen asked with a tired but kind smile. Matthew nodded, surprised that someone was speaking to him. "How did you know?" "Your eyes," she replied. "They still have that glimmer of disbelief, as if you can't believe this is happening to you." Ellen shared with him a piece of stale bread she had acquired. Matthew, who hours earlier would have rejected such a thing, accepted it gratefully. As they ate, Ellen told him her story. She had been a successful executive until a series of bad decisions and an addiction led her to lose everything. "The hardest part isn't the hunger or the cold," Ellen said in a quiet voice. "It's the way people look at you. Or worse, how they don't look at you at all. You become invisible." Her words resonated deeply with Matthew. He thought about how he had treated Emily and her father, and shame overwhelmed him. As the night progressed, Matthew heard more stories. He met John, a veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. He met Mary, a young woman who had fled an abusive home. Each story was a blow to his prejudices, a crack in the bubble he had lived in all his life. But it was the encounter with Charles that really shook Matthew to his core. Charles was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and calloused hands. He found him sharing a sandwich with his young son. "My wife is sick," Charles explained when Matthew approached. "She needs medications we can't afford, so I give my share of the food to my son. As long as he's okay, I can endure anything." Those words made Matthew remember Emily and her father. The similarity of the situation hit him hard. Here was another father sacrificing everything for his child, maintaining his dignity despite the circumstances. "How do you do it?" Matthew asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you keep hope?" Charles smiled, hugging his son. "Because each day is a new opportunity. Because as long as I have my family, I have a reason to keep fighting. And because I believe that, in the end, kindness prevails." That night, curled up in a corner of the park, Matthew couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts. He thought about all the times he had judged others without knowing their story, about how he had taken his privilege for granted, and above all he thought about Emily and her father, about their honesty and dignity in the face of adversity. Now he understood the value of what they had done and the injustice of how he had treated them. As the sky began to clear, announcing a new day, Matthew made a decision. He would not only find Emily and her father to apologize, but he would do everything possible to help them, and not just them, but all the people he had met that night. With that resolution in mind, he got up, ready to face the new day and the lessons that were still to come. Matthew's transformation had begun, and with it, a new hope for those whom society had forgotten. Dawn found Matthew walking the city streets with a new perspective. His clothes, once impeccable, were now wrinkled and dirty. His stomach growled with hunger, and every muscle in his body ached from having slept on the hard ground of the park. However, in his eyes shone a determination that hadn't been there the day before. As he walked the streets in search of Emily and her father, Matthew began to see the city with different eyes. The luxurious storefronts he once admired now seemed obscene in their ostentation. The people who passed by hurriedly, ignoring those who slept on the sidewalks, painfully reminded him of himself just a day ago. It was on one of these walks that Matthew had an encounter that would change the course of his day. On a corner, he saw a young woman struggling to carry several shopping bags while trying to control two small children. Without thinking twice, Matthew approached to help. "Allow me," he said, extending his hands towards the bags. The woman looked at him distrustfully at first, but something in Matthew's sincere look convinced her. She handed him a couple of bags, grateful. As they walked, the woman, who introduced herself as Laura, began to talk. She told him she was a single mother and worked 2 jobs to support her children. Each day was a struggle, but she remained optimistic for the sake of her little ones. "Sometimes I think about giving up," Laura confessed with a broken voice, "but then I look at my children and I know I have to keep going. They deserve a better future." Her words resonated deeply with Matthew. He thought about his own father, how he had built an empire from scratch. How many times had he faced moments of doubt and despair? How many sacrifices had he made for him? Upon reaching Laura's modest apartment, Matthew offered to help her carry the bags up. It was then that he noticed one of the children, the youngest, was limping slightly. "Is he okay?" he asked, pointing to the child. Laura sighed. "He needs an operation," she explained, "but I can't afford it. Every penny I earn goes to food and rent." Matthew felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Here was a mother struggling to give the best to her children, facing challenges he couldn't even imagine. And yet she maintained hope and dignity. Before leaving, Matthew asked her if she knew a girl named Emily and her father. To his surprise, Laura nodded. "I've seen them around the neighborhood," she said. "They're good people. The other day, Emily's father shared his last piece of bread with my son when we had nothing to eat. There's so much kindness in them, despite their situation." Those words were the last straw. Matthew felt tears threatening to spring from his eyes. The kindness of Emily and her father, even in the most difficult circumstances, contrasted sharply with his own selfish behavior. "Thank you, Laura," Matthew said with a choked voice. "You've helped me more than you can imagine." He left the apartment with a new mission. Not only would he find Emily and her father to apologize, but he would do everything possible to help Laura and her children too. Hours passed as Matthew roamed the streets, asking every homeless person he encountered if they knew Emily and her father. Many ignored him, others looked at him with distrust, but some, recognizing the sincerity in his eyes, tried to help. It was almost at sunset when he finally got a lead. An old man selling newspapers on a corner told him he had seen a girl and a man who matched the description, heading towards an old abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. With his heart beating rapidly, Matthew headed there. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when he arrived at the building in question. It was a decrepit structure with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. Cautiously, he entered the building. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Emily, sir." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, he heard a faint noise coming from one of the back rooms. He approached slowly, and there, huddled in a corner, he saw Emily and her father. Jack stood up immediately, placing himself protectively in front of his daughter. His eyes widened with surprise as he recognized Matthew. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and distrust. Matthew, with his heart in his throat, took a step forward. I've come to apologize," he said, his voice breaking. "What I did, how I treated you, it was wrong, very wrong." Emily peeked out from behind her father, her big eyes full of curiosity and a glimmer of hope. Matthew continued, the words coming out in a rush. "I've spent the last 24 hours on the street. I've seen and experienced things I never imagined, and I realized how wrong I was. About you, about everything." Jack and Emily exchanged a look of surprise. "Why did you do that?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm. Matthew smiled sadly. "Because I needed to learn a lesson. And boy, did I learn it." He told them about his experience, about the people he had met, about how his perspective had changed. With each word, Jack and Emily could see the transformation in him, the genuine humility and repentance in his eyes. "What you did," Matthew said, looking directly at Emily, "returning that card despite your situation, it was incredible. You have more integrity and strength than I've ever had." Emily, moved by the sincerity in Matthew's voice, took a step forward. "We all make mistakes," she said with wisdom beyond her years. "What's important is to learn from them." Jack, who had been observing in silence, finally spoke. "We appreciate your apology," he said in a calm voice. "But what do you plan to do now?" Matthew took a deep breath. "I want to help," he declared. "Not just you, but all the people I've met in these 24 hours. I've lived in a bubble of privilege all my life, and it's time I use that privilege to do something good." Jack looked at him intently, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded. "The true test of your change will be in your actions, not your words," he said. "I know," Matthew responded, "and I'm ready to prove it." At that moment, Matthew's phone, which his father had returned to him that morning, began to ring. It was Alexander Thompson. "To Matthew," his father's voice said on the other end of the line. "It's time for you to return. Have you learned anything?" Matthew looked at Emily and Jack, a determination burning in his eyes. "Yes, Dad," he replied. "I've learned a lot, and there's something I need you to do for me." As Matthew explained his plan to his father, Emily and Jack exchanged a look of hope. Maybe, just maybe. And on the other side of the table, visibly uncomfortable in the luxurious surroundings, were Emily and Jack. "Well," Alexander began, his voice resonating in the room, "Matthew has told me about his experience and about you. I must say, I'm impressed by your honesty and ashamed of how you were initially treated." Jack nodded, silently acknowledging the recognition. Emily, for her part, looked at everything with big, curious eyes, as if she were in a fantasy world. Dad, Matthew intervened, leaning forward. "I've promised them help, not just them, but all the people I met during my time on the street. I need your support to make it a reality." Alexander looked at his son with a mixture of pride and caution. "What do you have in mind?" Matthew took a deep breath and began to outline his plan. He talked about creating an affordable housing program, establishing job training centers, providing free healthcare for those who couldn't afford it. With each word, his passion and conviction grew. "And I want Jack and Emily to be an integral part of this project," Matthew concluded. "No one understands the needs of these people better than someone who has lived their reality." There was a moment of silence when Matthew finished speaking. Jack seemed stunned, while Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying his son. "It's an ambitious plan," he finally said, "and expensive. I know, Matthew replied without hesitation, but we have the resources to make it a reality, and more importantly, it's the right thing to do. Alexander looked at Jack and Emily. What do you think? He asked. Jack, who had been silent until that moment, cleared his throat. It's more than we could have ever imagined, he said with an emotional voice. But if you can really do this, it would change the lives of so many people. Emily, unable to contain her excitement, intervened. We could help Laura and her children, and Ellen and Charles and everyone else. Alexander smiled at the girl's enthusiasm. Then, he turned his attention back to Matthew. You've changed, son, he said softly. I see a maturity and compassion in you that wasn't there before. Matthew nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. I've learned a lot in a short time, he admitted, and I want to keep learning, keep growing. Alexander stood up, his decision made. Very well, he declared. We'll do this, but with one condition. Everyone in the room held their breath. I want you, Matthew, to lead this project, Alexander said. It will be your responsibility to ensure it's done correctly and that it truly helps those who need it. Matthew felt a mixture of excitement and fear at the responsibility, but nodded with determination. I'll do it, Dad. I won't let you down. Emily, unable to contain her joy, jumped from her chair and hugged Matthew. Thank you, she exclaimed. Jack, with tears in his eyes, shook Alexander's hand. I don't know how to thank you, he said with a broken voice. Alexander smiled. Don't thank us yet, he replied. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And so, in that boardroom, a project was born that would change not only the lives of Emily and Jack, but those of hundreds of people in the city. It was the beginning of a journey of redemption for Matthew, a journey of hope for those who had lost faith in humanity. As the group began to discuss the details of the plan, Emily looked out the window at the city stretching beyond. For the first time in a long time, she saw a bright future, not just for her and her father, but for all those who, like them, had struggled in the shadows of society. The sun shone brightly, as if the universe itself was smiling at this new hope, and in the hearts of all present, a spark of faith in human kindness was ignited, promising to illuminate even the darkest corners of the city. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The project, which Emily had affectionately dubbed Hearts Without Homes, began to take shape quickly. Matthew, true to his word, immersed himself fully in the work. He spent hours meeting with urban development experts, social workers, and community leaders. Every night he returned home exhausted, but with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. Jack, for his part, became a valuable advisor. His first-hand experience on the streets proved invaluable in identifying the true needs of the homeless community. He worked side by side with Matthew, offering perspectives that no consultant could provide. And Emily, with her inexhaustible energy and compassionate heart, became the spirit of the project. She visited the places where new homes were being built, chatted with families who would receive help, and always had a word of encouragement for everyone. One afternoon, while supervising the construction of the first community center, Matthew approached Jack. "How are we doing?" he asked, genuinely interested in the man's opinion. Jack looked around, observing the bustle of activity, the smiles on the faces of the people working on the project. "It's amazing," he replied with an emotional voice. "I never thought I'd see something like this in my life." Matthew nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. "All of this started thanks to you and Emily," he said. "Your honesty, your integrity, that's what triggered all of this." At that moment, Emily came running up, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, Matthew, come see this." She led them to a part of the building where a group of children was painting a mural. The design showed a sunrise over the city, with figures of people helping each other. "It's beautiful," Matthew murmured, moved by the scene. "This is more than building structures," Jack said, putting a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "You're building hope." As they observed the mural, Laura, the single mother Matthew had met during his time on the streets, approached them. She was wearing a nurse's uniform and had a radiant smile on her face. "I wanted to thank you," she said, with tears of joy in her eyes. "Thanks to the training program, I was able to get my nursing certification, and my son, his operation is scheduled for next week." Emily jumped for joy and hugged Laura, while Matthew and Jack exchanged looks of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of change they had hoped to achieve. However, not everything was rosy. As the project grew, so did the challenges. There were problems with building permits, neighbors who opposed the idea of having low-cost housing in their area, and even some local politicians who saw the project as a threat to their own interests. One night, after a particularly difficult day dealing with local bureaucracy, Matthew found himself sitting in his father's office, feeling discouraged. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad," he admitted. "There are so many obstacles, so much resistance." Alexander looked at his son with a mixture of understanding and pride. "Matthew," he said softly, "real change is never easy. There will always be those who resist and who fear the unknown. But remember why you're doing this." Matthew nodded slowly, remembering the faces of all the people who had been touched by the project so far. "You're right," he said, feeling his determination renewed. "I can't give up now." "And you won't do it alone," Alexander added, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Matthew. You've grown more in these weeks than in all the previous years." Those words meant more to Matthew than his father could imagine. With renewed energy, he immersed himself back in the work, determined to overcome every obstacle that presented itself. As the months passed, the Hearts Without Homes project began to bear visible fruits. The first affordable housing complex was almost finished. The community center buzzed with activity, and dozens of people had found employment thanks to the training programs. Emily, who now regularly attended school thanks to the project's support, had become a sort of mascot for everyone involved. Her contagious enthusiasm and innate compassion inspired everyone around her. One afternoon, while Emily was helping organize a job fair at the community center, she noticed an older man sitting alone in a corner, looking dejected. Without hesitation, she approached him. "Hello," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Emily. Is everything okay?" The man looked up, surprised by the genuine interest in the girl's voice. I don't know," he admitted. "I've been looking for work for months, but no one wants to hire an old man like me." Emily frowned, thoughtful. Then her eyes lit up with an idea. "Come with me," she exclaimed, taking the man's hand and guiding him to where Matthew was talking with some potential employers. "Matthew," Emily interrupted, not caring about manners at that moment. "This gentleman needs an opportunity. He's older, but I'm sure he has a lot of experience. Can't we find him something?" Matthew, surprised by the interruption but moved by Emily's determination, looked at the man with interest. "What's your name, sir?" "Robert," the man replied, straightening up a bit. "I was a carpenter for 40 years before I lost everything." A spark of inspiration shone in Matthew's eyes. "Robert, would you like to teach your trade to others? We're looking for instructors for our training programs." Robert's face lit up with hope. "Are you serious?" I'd love to." And so, thanks to Emily's intervention, another life was changed. Robert not only found a new purpose, but his experience proved invaluable to the project. However, not all challenges were resolved so easily. One morning, Jack arrived at Matthew's office with worrying news. "Graffiti has appeared on the new homes," he said, showing him photos on his phone. "Hate messages, saying they don't want bums in the neighborhood." Matthew felt anger and frustration overwhelm him. They had worked so hard, and this is how the community responded. But before he could react, Emily, who had been listening, intervened. "What if we organize a community painting day?" she suggested. "We could invite all the neighbors, new and old, to paint together over those ugly messages. That way they'd get to know each other and see that we're all the same." Matthew and Jack looked at each other, once again amazed by the girl's wisdom. "That's brilliant," Matthew said. Emily's idea was a resounding success. The painting day turned into a big community party with music, food, and most importantly, conversations. Neighbors who previously looked at each other with distrust now shared stories and laughter as they painted together. At the end of the day, where there were once messages of hate, there were now beautiful murals celebrating the diversity and unity of the community. That night, as Matthew drove back home, he reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, his biggest concern was what suit to wear to a party or what new car to buy. Now, he felt truly alive, connected to a purpose greater than himself. He thought about Emily and Jack, about how a simple act of honesty had triggered all of this. He thought about his father, whose support and guidance had been invaluable. And he thought about all the lives they were changing one at a time. As he pulled into his building's parking lot, Matthew made a decision. Tomorrow, he would talk to his father. It was time to expand the project, to take it beyond this city. There was so much to do, honey, so many lives to touch. With determination, Matthew headed to his apartment. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in his life, he felt completely prepared to face it. The Hearts Without Hope one's expectations. What began as a local initiative had become a national model for social change. Matthew, Jack, and Emily frequently traveled, sharing their experience and helping other cities implement similar programs. However, fate had one more surprise in store for this extraordinary family. One afternoon, as Matthew was reviewing some documents in his office, he received an unexpected call. It was a private investigator who had been hired by Alexander Thompson months ago. "Mr. Thompson," the voice on the other end of the line said, "how he found information about Emily's biological parents." Matthew was left breathless. When they began working closely with Jack and Emily, Alexander had discreetly initiated a search for the girl's origins, hoping to reunite her with any relatives if they existed. "What did you discover?" Matthew asked, his heart beating rapidly. "It's complicated, sir," the investigator replied. "I think it's better if you come to my office and bring Jack and Emily." Hours later, Matthew, Jack, and Emily were sitting in the investigator's office, waiting with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to assimilate," the investigator began, looking especially at Jack. "We have confirmed that Emily is, in fact, Jack's biological daughter." A stunned silence filled the room. Emily looked at Jack with wide eyes, while he seemed to have been struck by lightning. "But how?" Jack managed to articulate. The investigator explained that 11 years ago, Jack had been briefly married to a woman named Sarah. Due to financial problems and addiction issues, their marriage had quickly crumbled. Sarah had left Jack without telling him she was pregnant. Sarah gave birth to Emily and left her in an orphanage, the investigator continued. Jack, at that time, had hit rock bottom due to depression and alcoholism. He lost his job, his home, and eventually ended up on the streets. Emily, with tears in her eyes, took Jack's hand. "So, you were always my real dad?" Jack, overwhelmed with emotion, could only nod, hugging Emily tightly. Matthew observed the scene, moved beyond words. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, had reunited this father and daughter in the most improbable way. "There's more," said the investigator, catching everyone's attention again. "Sarah passed away a few years ago, but before she died, she left a letter for Emily at the orphanage. We've recovered it." With trembling hands, Emily took the envelope offered by the investigator. Inside was a letter and a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. As Emily read the letter aloud, everyone in the room felt the weight of the words. Sarah expressed her deep regret for having abandoned her daughter, explained the circumstances that led her to make that decision, and expressed her hope that Emily would find the love and happiness she couldn't give her. "You will always be my little miracle," Emily read, her voice breaking with emotion. "And although I couldn't be the mother you deserved, I pray that you find someone who loves you as much as I wanted to." Jack, with tears running down his face, hugged Emily even tighter. "She did," he whispered. "I found you, my girl, and I've loved you from the first moment, without knowing you were my own blood." Matthew, feeling he was witnessing too intimate a moment, quietly excused himself and left the office to give them privacy. In the hallway, he encountered his father, who had arrived after receiving a call from Matthew. "How are they taking it?" Alexander asked, concerned. Matthew, with moist eyes, smiled. It's beautiful, Dad," The universe has a peculiar way of making things right. Alexander nodded, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, the family we choose turns out to be the family that was destined for us from the beginning. As father and son waited outside, they reflected on the incredible journey that had brought everyone to this moment. What started with a lost credit card had triggered a series of events that not only changed lives, but reunited a family separated by fate. Inside the office, Jack and Emily continued to embrace, processing the revelation they had just received. Their bond, already strong from shared experiences, had now deepened even further with the knowledge of their true relationship. And so, in a simple investigator's office, a new chapter in the life of this extraordinary family began to be written, full of promises, love, and the certainty that sometimes miracles happen in the most unexpected ways. The days following the revelation were an emotional roller coaster for Jack and Emily. They spent hours talking, laughing, and crying together, processing the incredible news of their true relationship. Every shared memory, every moment of connection they had experienced on the streets, now had an even deeper meaning. Matthew, for his part, stayed close, offering silent support and making sure father and daughter had everything they needed to process this new reality. He saw how the bond between them, already strong before, deepened even more with each passing day. One morning, as they were having breakfast together in the apartment the project had provided for them, Emily looked at Jack with bright eyes. "Dad," she said, savoring the word with a new understanding, "do you think Mum would be proud of us?" Jack, moved by the question, took his daughter's hand. "I'm sure she would be, my girl. You've grown to be a wonderful, compassionate and strong person, and together, we've helped change the lives of many people." Emily smiled, but then her expression turned thoughtful. "Do you think we could someday help other families reunite, like what happened to us?" That simple question ignited a spark in Jack. That same afternoon, he met with Matthew to discuss a new idea for the Hearts Without Homes project. "I want to start a family reunification program," Jack explained enthusiastically. "How is it there are so many families separated by poverty, addictions, or circumstances? If Emily and I could find each other, maybe we can help others do the same." Matthew listened attentively, feeling that a new door was opening in their mission. "It's a brilliant idea, Jack," he said with a smile. "Let's make it happen." In the following weeks, the team worked tirelessly to establish the new program. They hired investigators, social workers, and family counselors. They established partnerships with orphanages and adoption agencies. Little by little, the Lost Bonds program began to take shape. On the day of the program's official launch, the community center was packed with people, hopeful families, social workers, and media gathered to hear about this new initiative. Emily, dressed in a beautiful blue dress, took the podium alongside her father. With a clear and confident voice, she shared their story, explaining how she and Jack had discovered their true relationship. "Our story is proof that miracles exist," Emily said, her voice full of emotion. "And we want to help more families experience that miracle. Every person deserves to know their roots, their history, and every separated family deserves the chance to reunite." Jack took the microphone next, his eyes shining with pride as he looked at his daughter. "The Lost Bonds program will not only seek to reunite families," he explained, "it will also offer psychological support, legal help, and resources to help these families stay together once they find each other." The audience listened in silence, many with tears in their eyes. Among the crowd, Matthew saw faces full of hope, people who may have lost faith in finding their loved ones. When the presentation ended, the room erupted in applause. Journalists rushed forward to ask questions, families approached to sign up for the program, and social workers offered their support and expertise. Amidst the bustle, Matthew approached Jack and Emily. "You did an incredible job," he told them, hugging them both. "You're giving hope to so many people." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with determination. "It's just the beginning," she said. "I have a feeling that Lost Bonds is going to change many lives." And boy, was she right. In the months that followed, The program began to bear fruit beyond their most optimistic expectations. Families that had been separated for years were reunited. Parents who had lost custody of their children due to addictions, now recovered, had the opportunity to reconnect. Siblings separated by the adoption system finally found each other. Each success story was a validation of the work they were doing. But for Jack and Emily, each family reunion was also a reminder of their own miraculous story. One afternoon, as they were reviewing some cases in the office, Emily suddenly stopped, looking at her father with eyes full of tears. "What's wrong, my girl?" Jack asked, concerned. Emily smiled through the tears. "It's just that sometimes I still can't believe you're my real dad. That after everything we went through, fate brought us together like this." Jack hugged his daughter tightly. "I can't believe it sometimes either," he admitted, "but every day I'm grateful for it and for the opportunity to help others experience this same joy." As father and daughter shared that intimate moment, Matthew watched them from the office door, feeling a wave of gratitude and amazement. He remembered that day at the hotel when he had treated Emily and Jack with disdain and suspicion, how much he had changed since then, how much they had all changed. The Hearts Without Homes project and now Lost Bonds had become much more than simple social aid programs. They were a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and how a simple act of kindness could trigger a wave of positive change. That night, as Matthew drove back home, he reflected on the incredible journey they had embarked on. From a lost credit card to a movement that was changing lives across the country. From an arrogant and privileged young man to a man committed to making the world a better place. And at the center of it all were Emily and Jack, two souls who had faced adversity with dignity and love, and who were now helping others find hope in the midst of darkness. As the city lights shone around him, Matthew smiled. The future was bright, full of possibilities, and he was grateful to be part of this extraordinary story of redemption and love. Time flew by, and before they knew it, the first anniversary of the Lost Bonds program had arrived. To celebrate, they organized a big event at the community center, inviting all the families that had been reunited thanks to the program. The hall was decorated with balloons and banners, and the air buzzed with the excitement of hundreds of people whose lives had been transformed. Matthew, Jack, and Emily moved through the crowd, greeting families and listening to their stories. In one corner, they saw Robert, the former carpenter, now an instructor in the training program, surrounded by his students. They were all laughing and sharing anecdotes about their recent projects. Laura, the nurse who had once struggled to feed her children, now ran the community clinic. Her son, fully recovered from his operation, was running and playing with other children. As Emily observed the scene, she felt her heart swell with joy. "It's like a dream," she told her father. "Look at how many lives we've touched." Jack hugged his daughter, sharing her excitement. "And it all started with you, my girl. Your honesty and your pure heart were the spark that ignited all of this." At that moment, Alexander Thompson took the stage, asking for everyone's attention. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the man who had made all this possible with his support and resources. "A year ago," Alexander began, his voice full of emotion, "my son Matthew presented me with an idea that, I confess him at first, seemed far-fetched to me." There was laughter in the audience. "But that idea, born from compassion and determination to do good, has blossomed into something beautiful and transformative." Matthew, standing next as he heard the pride in his father's voice. "Today," Alexander continued, "we not only celebrate the success of
Lost Bonds and Hearts Without Homes, we celebrate the power and the capacity of human beings to overcome any adversity when we come together." He paused,
searching for Emily and Jack in the crowd with his gaze. And all of this began with a simple act of honesty. A girl and her father, who had nothing material to offer, but whose integrity was worth more than any wealth. Emily felt tears running down her cheeks as Jack hugged her tightly. "So today," Alexander concluded, "I want to announce that the Thompson Foundation is committed to expanding these programs nationwide. We want every city to have its own Hearts Without Homes and Lost Bonds, because we believe that every person deserves a home, a family, and an opportunity. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Matthew, overwhelmed with emotion, went up on stage and hugged his father. Then he extended his hand towards Emily and Jack, inviting them to join them. There, on the stage, the two families merged in an embrace, Alexander and Matthew, whose relationship had deepened and strengthened through this journey. Jack and Emily, whose bond had transcended adversities and had been revealed as a tie of blood and unconditional love. As the audience applauded, Emily looked around at all the smiling and hopeful faces. She remembered that day, seemingly an eternity ago, when she found a credit card on the street. She could never have imagined that small act of honesty would trigger all of this. "Thank you," she whispered. Though no one could hear her over the noise of the celebration, she was thanking the universe, fate, whatever force had orchestrated this incredible series of events. That night, as the party continued, with music, dancing, and the joy of hundreds of reunited families, Emily realized that her journey was just beginning. There was so much more to do, so many more lives to touch. But as she looked at her father, at Matthew and Alexander, she knew that together they could achieve anything, because love, compassion, and integrity were forces more powerful than any adversity. And so, in the midst of the celebration, Emily made a silent promise. She would continue to fight, continue to help, continue to love. Because now she knew that even the smallest gesture could trigger a wave of change that would transform the world. Emily's story, which began on the cold streets of an indifferent city, now expanded, touching lives across the country, and in every transformed life, in every reunited family, in every heart filled with hope, her legacy would live forever. As the lights shone and the music played, Emily closed her eyes and smiled. The future was bright, full of infinite possibilities, and she was ready to face it, with love in her heart and determination in her spirit.